Everyone's ready? Okay, excellent. So welcome back. We're going to continue from where we left off last week. Um, Remember again, we keep coming back to this theme in the Kuzari about speculative religion and prescribed, right? Following the mitzvot as God commanded them. And this brought us into speculative interpretation of the mitzvot as opposed to prescribed, where we see the differentiation between the Karaite way of following the Torah, where they reject the rabbinic tradition and they start interpreting the Torah as they see fit, which then kind of branches out into many possible interpretations as opposed to one authoritative interpretation of the Torah. And then here we see the rabbi says, right, this is all part of the realm of speculative religion, what the Karaim are doing. He says, however, those who follow tradition live with confidence and inner calm, like citizens secure within an ancient fortified city, unafraid of attack. Right? We have what we call a Kabbalah. Kabbalah means transmission. We saw the book of transmission by Rabbi Abraham ibn Daud, right, last week. We saw how he goes through the entire chain of tradition. Well, that's the entire book that he wrote. And every single tradition was received in the Supreme Court and testified to in the Supreme Court. We take our transmission of tradition very, very seriously. And therefore, we can be very, very calm and secure in the tradition that we received. And there's no need for any kind of neurosis. Am I like being completely, neurotic? Am I performing the mitzvot correctly? Right? Is when we are making the matzah, is it 18 minutes, like from beginning to end? And let's try to be as mahmir as possible on everything we do because we don't know if we're performing the mitzvot correctly or not. He says, no, we have the mitzvot, we have the tradition, we have the interpretation, right? Is a kizait really the size of a zait? Or is it, I don't know, some astronomical measurement? And therefore, when I have matzah and then a seder, am I yotzei yedei chovah in this little amount, the size of an olive, which is exactly what the Hachamim prescribed, kizait. How much is a kizait? A zait, an olive, the amount of an olive, no more and no less, right? Or do I need to now, eat my matzah very, very quickly because for the size of the zait is this big, right? Okay, the zait is now this big. For the size of the matzah, I need to eat. However, the time that I need to eat it, right, is the amount of time that you eat 3 zaitim, 3 olives. The zait is going to be this small. So the amount that it'll take me to eat 3 small olives, I need to eat a huge olive worth of matzah. Right? It's not, there's no end to the neurosis that comes when you don't rely on the Hachamim. So just have faith in the Hachamim, in their interpretation of the Torah as they transmitted from generation to generation, from their times down to ours. And now we're going to go a little bit more in today's class into the difference between relying on a transmitted tradition and a speculative interpretation of the Torah. So overall, he says, what you're saying is convincing. However, the Torah, it says, the Rabbi says, the Torah itself commands that there should be one Torah. Torah ahat yelachem. One Torah. One law. If the Karaite approach were to prevail, there would be as many versions of Judaism as there are individual opinions, which unfortunately is really what we see today after 2,000 years of Galut and every single community adopting its own stringencies, right? Like when someone comes and asks you, today you go to a rabbi, you ask him a question in halacha, and his first question to you is, are you Ashkenazi or Sephardi? Says that question should be irrelevant. Torah ahat, there's one Torah. What is the halacha? There's this, my wife was complaining to me this past Shabbat, she's reading this shoot. There's this questions and answers that they send to a rabbi that she's reading in this, I don't know, Torah tidbits or one of these things. And she reads the question. There's 3 pages going into this person says this person says this person says this, right? Going into all these million different opinions. And on the bottom line, there's no bottom line. It says it's like 50% chance it's mutar, 50% chance it's asur. There's no bottom line. Someone asked the question, is it mutar or asur? 3 pages to tell you, I don't know. If you don't know, just say from the beginning. If you look at the early Chachamim, when they receive a question, is this mutar or asur? They respond with one word, mutar. And then they write Katav Moshe, right? Moses wrote, Maimonides. That's how he would sign all of his answers. Today you go into 3 pages and there's no answer. So, unfortunately, today we're kind of living as he describes this Karaite situation. No person would remain consistent for long because every day he might develop a new interpretation, gain new understanding, or encounter someone else who persuades him in a different argument. This is exactly this 3-page long answer with no actual decisive bottom line. Whenever we do find agreement among them, meaning the Karaites, it is clear that they are actually relying on traditions inherited from earlier teachers. Even when you see the Karaites agree on an interpretation, it's not because that is the most obvious way to interpret a verse in the Torah. It's because they all agreed on a certain interpretation, which is exactly what they are objecting to when they reject the rabbinic tradition. In that case, we should ask them, if reason allows the word of God to be interpreted in countless ways, why do you yourselves agree on a particular ruling? Meaning they are relying on this own tradition that they received from their rabbi. And if they answer that it was the opinion of Anan is the original Karaite, or Benjamin, which is his son, Binyamin, Saul, or some other Karaite authority, then they have already admitted the authority of received tradition from earlier generations. If so, why not accept a stronger, more reliable tradition, that of the sages, who were authorized members of the Supreme Court of Israel? The sages were many, while those Karaite teachers were only isolated individuals. So why are you relying on the tradition of an individual and not on the tradition of an institution that represents the entire nation? The tradition of rabbis rests upon transmission received from the prophets, whereas the Karaites rest primarily upon private reasoning and speculation. So it's not just speculation regarding to religion, what laws should we follow, but also once we follow the laws, we all agree that there was revelation from Sinai and those are the laws. Now there's speculation or authoritative transmission of how to follow those laws. The sages maintain unity, right? Even when there's mahloket among the Chachamim, they then hold the vote and there is one bottom line that they publish to the public. Unfortunately, we don't have this kind of a big din anymore. The Karaites follow the division. The teachings of the sages emerge from the place which the Lord shall choose. Right? It says, Me'am makom asher yivhar Hashem. And this is Ve'asita kechol asher yurucha. From the place that God designated, you shall follow their instruction. Right? That is the mitzvah. How do they interpret that mitzvah? There is one place in Jerusalem, right? The seat of the Supreme Court. It says, Ve'asita kechol asher, and you should follow all their instructions. At least these Hakamim, they're sitting at that place. And for this reason, even their individual rulings carry authority. The Karaites possess no comparable institution. Right? Even if there was only one Hakam in the Sanhedrin, and he was sitting in the Sanhedrin, in Lishkat HaGazit, on the Temple Mount, in that place that God said, right, from the place that God chose, says, Kimi Sion Tetzeh Torah, right, from the Torah comes out from Zion, meaning the decrees that come out from the Temple Mount are the authoritative decrees. Even if there was one individual and not an entire group of 71 sages, it would still be preferable than following a Karaite who was just an individual somewhere out there in the world. I would especially like to hear the answer regarding the calculations of the new moon. How do you sanctify a new moon, a new month? Right? Originally, you're supposed to have witnesses that come to court. They testify to the new moon, and the court makes a legal decree or decision that today is Rosh Chodesh. In practice, even their own authorities follow rabbinic calculations for determining leap years and adding the month of Adar. Yet they mock the rabbis by asking, how could you possibly know whether Yom Kippur falls on the 9th or the 10th of Tishrei? Right? Even there's two things with the leap year. There's a leap year and a leap month. A month is 29 days, and it could be 30 days. A year could be 12 months or 13 months. It's to the discretion of the court when to add an extra day or when to add an extra month to the year. If you add an extra day to Elul, right? Then Yom Kippur, right? Elul is the month right before Tishrei. Then Rosh Hashanah is pushed off an extra day. Yom Kippur is pushed off an extra day. How do you know if Yom Kippur is on the 9th of Tishrei or the 10th of Tishrei? You have to know if the court added an extra day or not. So you see, the Karaites themselves rely on the rabbinical court for knowing what the date is. But if they themselves cannot determine with certainty whether the month is Elul or Tishrei, right? If today is the first day of Tishrei or the last day of Elul, or Tishrei and Mar Heshvan, right, the next month after, except by relying on rabbinic tradition, then what grounds do they have for criticism? It is like a drowning man mocking someone else for being wet. Right? Someone jumped into the sea, he splashed people on board. Ha ha, I got you wet. He's like, ha ha, I got you wet. Ha ha, you're drowning in the sea. Our Torah is rooted either in the authority given to Moses at Sinai, Halakha Moshe is Sinai, transmitted authority from Sinai, one generation after another, or in the authority that emerged from the place which the Lord shall choose, right? When Moshe appointed the first court, right? Their authority isn't just to transmit the laws that were received, but they have what's called semicha, they have the authority also to legislate and interpret. And that is the only institution that has the authority to interpret. And it's written from Zion, Ki Sion Teseh Torah, right? Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, and the word of God from Jerusalem. Its authorized transmitters were the judges, officers, priests, and members of the Sanhedrin. So we're commanded to obey the judges of each generation. And it's written, you shall come to the judge who will be in those days, right? It says, Ve'asita kechol asher yorucha, and you shall act according to the word they declare, right, from the place which the Lord shall choose. Scripture further states, the man who acts arrogantly by refusing to obey the priest or judge is called a zaken mamre, someone who goes, he is brilliant, he's a brilliant student, he knows the laws, he knows all of the accepted tradition. He can actually sit as a member of the Sanhedrin, and he disagrees with the legislation of the Sanhedrin, and he acts as an individual differently than they said. It's called a zaken mamre. That's punishable by death offense. That man shall die, and you shall remove the evil from your midst. This is called an evil. Ubi'arta hara mikibbecha. Why is this an evil? Right? The rebellion against priest judges is treated as one of the gravest offenses, as shown by the phrase, and you shall remove the evil from your midst. And the passage concludes, and all the people shall hear and fear, and no longer act arrogantly. The man yishmeu v'yira'au. They should fear the Sanhedrin. Why is this such a grave offense? It's because you're turning the Torah into two Torot. You're branching the Torah into many different Torahs. This that we have an Ashkenazi Torah and a Sephardi Torah is a terrible, terrible thing. There is one Torah. We all need to follow one law. This refers to the period when the temple services, the Sanhedrin, the Levitical divisions were all functioning properly, and the divine presence was clearly among them, whether through prophecy and divine inspiration, as was still the case during the early Second Temple period. See, at the beginning of the Second Temple, we still had prophets. The last prophets we had was Malachi, Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah. The Chachamim say Ezra was Malachi. They're the same person. Among such people, conspiracy or collective fabrication would have been impossible. Right? Remember, we saw in Sefer HaKabbalah, they were referred to as Edim, Kesherim, Vene'emanim, right? Reliable and verified witnesses, receiving the tradition from reliable and verified witnesses. In the same way, later enactments, such as the reading of the book of Esther on Purim and the institution of Hanukkah, became binding. Right? These aren't mitzvot that we received from Sinai. Right? Two holidays that were instituted by the Supreme Court, Hanukkah and Purim, the rabbinic mitzvot. Thus, we recite the blessings such as who commanded us to read the Megillah, right? We say, Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'sivanu, right? He sanctified us in his mitzvot, and he commanded us to read the Megillah. And where did God command us to read the Megillah? Right? He didn't. but he commanded us to follow the instructions of the Supreme Court. And they legislated 2 holidays, Hanukkah and Purim, to read the Megillah, right, on Purim, and to light the Hanukkah on Hanukkah. We say, Asher Kiddeshanu, Memisvotav Esivanu, Lehadlik Ner Shel Hanukkah, right? Or to read the Hallel, to recite the Hallel, which is also a rabbinic legislation. And we say, Asher Kiddeshanu. Also, Netilat Yadayim, they say Asher Kiddeshanu, that's a rabbinic enactment, not Mitzvah de Oraita, or to wash the hands, or concerning the Eruv, right? It was before Shavuot, we had Shavuot right after, we had Shavuot and then Shabbat, in order to prepare food on Shavuot for Shabbat. There is a mitzvah we have to do in Eruv Tavshinin. We say Asher Kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav esivanu an Eruv Tavshinin. Had these practices emerged merely as post-exilic customs without authoritative tradition, they would have been treated as commandments. They would not have been treated as commandments requiring blessing, but merely as local customs or regulations. The vast majority of our laws, however, originate with Moshe himself as laws given to Moses from Sinai. Right, like today, we have many different things that we do. Like there's a custom on Rosh Hashanah to do tashlich, to go. You have to see a body of water, and you throw out bread from your crumbs from your pocket, right? And you do like vidui and whatever. It's a custom. There's no asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav esivanu, because it's just a custom. It's not authoritative legislation. And if you were not to do it, that's not a big deal. There's no mitzvah to do tashlich. Consider the verse, I make known the laws of God and his teachings together with, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Right? We have all these mitzvot. For instance, the calendar requires a lot of wisdom in it. Whoever wishes to deny this wisdom may look at the Karaites. The Karaites, they're completely ignorant. He says they're ignoramuses. They don't know astronomy. They don't know mathematics. The Hachamim, in order to be Hachamim, they have to know astronomy. They have to know mathematics. They need to know botany. Remember, we saw this already in the previous section of the Kuzari. But whoever wishes to confirm it should examine the branches of knowledge preserved in the Talmud, which represent only a small portion of the natural sciences, metaphysics, mathematics, astronomy cultivated by the sages. He will then recognize that the sages deserved praise above all nations for their wisdom. It says, Kihi chokhmatchem ubinatchem le'enei ha'amin, right? The Goyim will see that we have such wise laws, and they'll see us as a wise nation, right? What could they see that is wise? It's not, how machmir we are on Shabbat, but all these difficult laws that depend on astronomy and mathematics in order to fulfill. Some laws, under certain conditions already mentioned, emerged from the place which the Lord shall choose. Prophecy itself continued for about 40 years into the Second Temple era. Jeremiah praised the people of that generation for their piety, wisdom, fear of God. If we cannot rely upon such people, then upon who can we rely? Again, edim kesherim v'ne'emanim, mipi edim kesherim v'ne'emanim. We also see that enactments established after the death of Moses nevertheless became binding law. Solomon sanctified the middle of the courtyard. He increased the azara, the area where you can bring korbanot in the mikdash, offered sacrifices outside the main altar, and celebrated the festival for 7 days and 7 nights. David and Samuel established the order of the temple choir. Right? They took all the Levites, divided them into 24 groups. Right? They had their reserve duty, their miluim, right, was every 24 weeks there was a different group of Levim, that a different family that took up the service of the temple. Solomon modified aspects of the sanctuary structure. Ezra imposed upon the Second Temple community the obligation of contributing 1/3 of a shekel, not mahasita shekel, but 1/3 of the shekel. They needed more funds to maintain back then. The stone platform replaced the ark, hidden behind the curtains because they knew the ark had been buried there. Okay, so now the Kuzari has a good question. He says, okay, so wait a minute. We see that they have tradition and they also have authority to legislate. How does this fit in with the verse, the mitzvah, right? You shall not add to it nor subtract from it. You're telling me there's two holidays that the Chachamim, out of nowhere, they commanded us to keep. Mitzvot, they're listed as mitzvot dirabanan, to light the Hanukkah and to read the Megillah. How does that fit in with Bal Tosif u Bal Tigra? Not to add to the Torah, not to subtract from it. So the Kuzari, he has a different answer than Maimonides. We'll get it first into the Kuzari. It says this command was addressed to the general public, warning them not to invent laws based on their own theories and interpretation, as the Karaites do. Instead, they were instructed to follow the prophets, priests, and judges who came from Moses. The scripture says, I will raise up from them, meaning from the people, a prophet from among their brethren, Mikerev Achecha, and he shall speak to them all that I shall command him. Likewise, the Torah teaches that the rulings of the priests and judges are binding. Right, so we already see, V'asita kechol asher yurucha. It says, this law, this mitzvah, to not add or subtract from the Torah is based on personal speculation, meaning individuals can't add to the Torah or subtract from it, but the Supreme Court, as a legislative body of Israel, can. They can legislate new things. The prohibition against adding or subtracting from the Torah applies to private individuals introducing their own innovations. It does not apply to what God commanded through Moses, through legitimate prophets, or through the priests and judges acting collectively from the place which the Lord shall choose. The Rambam explains it differently, because even the Sanhedrin cannot undo a mitzvah or add a mitzvah. They can legislate derabanan mitzvot, rabbinic legislation, but it doesn't have the status of a biblical legislation. Besides that, they can interpret biblical legislation. There are laws that were left ambiguous purposely. They were left by God ambiguous, giving the court the authority to interpret it, and a later court the authority to reinterpret it if they see fit to interpret a law differently. For instance, we do Kiddush on Shabbat, right? There's a mitzvah to do Kiddush. However, there is no tradition from Moshe what that Kiddush is. How do you perform the mitzvah of Kiddush? And the Chachamim interpret the mitzvah that you do Kiddush Zochreu ala yain, with a glass of wine. It's theoretically possible that a later court, maybe one day once the Sanhedrin is reinstituted, they say, well, people don't really like wine anymore. It doesn't really capture the sanctity of the Shabbat by doing Kiddush on a glass of wine. And from now on, Kiddush is to be done on a shot of whiskey. Theoretically, a later court can do that, and doing Kiddush on a glass shot of whiskey is now a mitzvah deoraita, theoretically. So they have the authority to reinterpret mitzvot, but not to add or subtract from them. They can add, rabbinic mitzvot, but not biblical mitzvot. And the prophets, they can add and subtract temporary mitzvot, meaning there's no Shabbat this week. God, I received a prophecy from God, and He said, this week we don't keep Shabbat. We have certain things we need to do. We need to build the walls. We need to build the fences. We're expecting an attack. There is no Shabbat this week, but it has to be temporary, meaning this week and not forever. Such authorities were guided by divine assistance, giving the number, meaning it wasn't an individual, it was a collective. Their learning, right, their wisdom and their responsibility, right, they were appointed as the judges of the nation. It is conceivable that they would collectively establish something that it is not conceivable, contradicts the Torah. They inherited a vast body of knowledge, right, the tradition, all the interpretations that were received from Moshe, and were uniquely qualified to preserve and apply it. Tradition even teaches that members of the Sanhedrin were required to master every branch of knowledge. Prophecy had only recently ceased, and the divine bat kol still remained. Meaning, even though 40 years into the Second Temple, right, they still had a prophet. After that, for the next few hundred years, they didn't have prophets, but they had what they call a bat kol. A bat kol means like a derivative, or like the daughter of the kol. What is the kol? Kol is what the Jewish people heard at Sinai. That is revelation. They heard a bat kol, like an echo of Sinai. It's a different way of saying that they had divine inspiration. Or here he calls it divine assistance, what we call Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh is a bat kol. Consider the dispute over the counting of the Omer. The Karaites interpret the phrase from the day after the Sabbath, right, to mean Sunday. What does the Torah say? When do you start counting the Omer? It says, Mimahorat HaShabbat, from after the Shabbat. What is the Shabbat? Naturally, we would probably think Shabbat means Saturday, right? And so when do we start counting the Omer? We start counting the Omer Saturday night or Sunday, right? Which is what we did this year. We have, so what happens if Pesach falls on a Tuesday? Pesach falls on a Tuesday. When do we start counting the Omer? The next day. That's when we start. The Karaites say no. We wait until Shabbat and we start on Sunday or Motzei Shabbat. That's when we start counting the Omer. So the Karaites, they interpret the phrase Mimachorat Shabbat, the day after the Shabbat, to mean Sunday. But one could argue that the judges, priests, pious kings, the Sanhedrin, the sages collectively understood the purpose of the command differently, to establish a fixed period of 50 days between the barley harvest, right, which is the Pesach, and the wheat harvest, which is in Shavuot, counting 7 complete weeks. Shabbat doesn't have to mean Saturday. For instance, a Shavua, even the term a week, could be 7 years, and the Shabbat being the Shemitah, the seventh year. Shabbat could also be understood as a general term for the holidays. So, Mimachorat Shabbat, the Supreme Court of Israel, the Hachamim, or the tradition that we received is that Mahorat Shabbat means the day after Yom Tov. So we have the first day of Pesach. After that first day of Pesach, right away, we start Sfirat HaOmer, counting the Omer. The authoritative tradition established that the count begins on the second day of Passover, right? Motzei Yom Tov. After the first day, entering the second day, we start Sfirat HaOmer. This does not contradict the Torah because the ruling emerges from the legitimate national institutions established by the Torah itself and under the conditions we have already discussed. It may even have been guided by divine inspiration. In any case, it provides a coherent and stable practice, avoiding the confusion created by endless private interpretations. So one person says Mahorat Shabbat is Motzei Yom Tov. Another person will say no, it's Motzei Shabbat. So imagine if another person will say it's Motzei Pesach, Shvi'i Shel Pesach, the seventh day of Pesach. Right? So one says, and Shabbat meaning the week of Pesach, after the week of Pesach. So everyone has a different counting of the Omer. One starts, imagine Pesach falls on Tuesday. One starts counting the Omer on Wednesday. The next one starts counting the Omer on Sunday. And the next one starts counting the Omer next Tuesday, after the seventh day of Pesach. Right? And then Shavuot has 3 different dates. With these broad and compelling arguments, Rabbi, you have already answered several objections I had hoped to raise in support of Karaite position. Since there are still many things that the Karaites do, right, that seem to make sense, or things that the rabbis do that seem not to make sense. However, the general idea I get, I accept. Right? I had many things I wanted to challenge you on, but you kind of answered me already, with the Omer and some other things. I thought they might challenge your case, but your principles seem to have addressed them before I even presented them. So once the fundamental principles are clear, one should not become overly distracted by isolated details. It's true there are many challenges you can bring, and he's still going to bring some. And the Kuzari is going to address them. But first, once it says le'olam yu klalim beyadecha. Once you have the general principle down, right? Don't get sidetracked by the details. The details are often complex, subject to misunderstanding, and can lead people astray when viewed from a narrow perspective. Right? And we're going to see a few cases like this. But once you understand the general principle, the Torah can't possibly be left to individual interpretation. And there's an infinite amount of ways you can interpret the Torah. So there has to be, besides the tradition, there has to be an authoritative institute that publishes what the interpretation is for everybody to follow, therefore preventing the Torah from splintering into a million different Torot. A person who is convinced of God's justice and all-encompassing wisdom is not troubled by occasional appearances of injustice in the world. And sometimes you see something happening, says, oh, how brutal nature can be, right? But we understand God is compassionate, God has mercy, God is just, and He guides His world in this way. So even when you encounter unjust things, you need to understand maybe I'm not seeing the bigger picture, but I trust in God's justice. Same way as sometimes I come across things in halakha that may not make sense to me, I trust in the hachamim. I don't need to be extra stringent. If the hachamim said act in a certain way, we can act, we can rely on them. In the same way, apparent difficulties in particular laws should not cause us to abandon sound principles that have already been firmly established. The tradition is firmly established. The authority of the Sanhedrin has been firmly established. For our case and purposes, the authority of the Talmud has been firmly established. There's no need to deviate from it at all. Says, even so, I'm not completely satisfied. Although I accept the general principles, I still wish to discuss some of the specific cases. Says, Bechabod, speak. Let me begin with this. Does not the Torah explicitly teach retaliation? Does it not say an eye for an eye? This is maybe one of the most famous challenges, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. As he has caused injury to another person, so shall it be done to him. Right? The Torah explicitly says an eye for an eye. But does the Torah not immediately continue saying whoever kills an animal shall make restitution for it, life for life, right? Nefesh benefesh, or this is nefesh tahat nefesh. This clearly establishes the principle of compensation. The Torah does not mean that if someone kills your horse, you shall kill his horse in return. Rather, you receive compensation for the loss. After all, what benefit would there be in destroying his horse as well? Right? Someone came and destroyed your car. So what does it help you if you now destroy his car? Now there's two people without cars. So what does tahat mean? By the way, that's a way to interpret the verse. For instance, when it comes and discusses the death of a person, right? Someone murdered someone. There is no compensation for that. The penalty for that is capital punishment. You kill him. And there is no, it's called kofir. There's no kofir that can be done. No ransom. You can't ransom someone else's life. However, it says over there, it says nefesh benefesh. Over here, it says tahat, instead of. So it's the compensation. That could be read into the literal meaning of the verse. Never mind that the Hachamim came and interpreted for us or passed down the tradition that it means monetary compensation. So what happens if someone destroys your car? They need to pay you compensation for your car, not destroy his car. Or how does it work explicitly in the verses? If someone's ox gored and killed your ox, then what do? You keep his ox. That's a cow for a cow. You don't kill his ox. This clearly establishes the principle of compensation, right? Whoever kills an animal shall make restitution for it, life for life. Here it explicitly says, nefesh, tahat nefesh means you shall make restitution. The Torah does not mean that if someone kills your horse, right, after what benefit? Okay, we said that. The same applies if someone injures your hand. The goal is not to injure his hand in return, but to compensate you for the value of the loss. The literal application of wound for wound, this is habura, tahad habura, right? Or stripe for stripe, creates difficulties that common sense cannot resolve. How could such a system be applied fairly? Just tell me, how can you actually apply this system? Someone wounds you, you wound them back. How do you do that? People are different. They have different tolerance for pain, right? One person might die from a particular injury while another survives the very same wound. You inflict the exact same wound on someone else, but now you caused him to die. So it, is that comparable? Is that a comparable punishment? An eye for an eye? How could a court determine that the injuries are truly equivalent, or consider a one-eyed person who blinds someone with two healthy eyes? Right? One person is already missing an eye, and he caused a fully a person who can see fully well to lose his eyesight completely. So now you're going to take out his eye, or the opposite person has vision in one eye, and he hit someone else and caused one of his eyes to go blind. Now the other person could only see in one eye. How do you retaliate against the person who already only sees in one eye? It says these are things that you can't, common sense doesn't allow you, that there is no way to literally fulfill these mitzvot. If we literally blind the offender's remaining eye, he becomes completely blind, while the victim still retains sight in one eye. How would that constitute equal justice? There is no real way to literally fulfill these commandments as prescribed by the Torah without the interpretation of the oral tradition. The Torah itself says, as he has caused injury to a person, so shall it be done to him. The intent is that justice should correspond to the damage caused, not necessarily that the identical physical act be repeated. In any case, why continue debating individual examples when we have already established that the necessity of tradition and the reliability, wisdom, and religious integrity of those who transmitted it, right? Edim, Keshirim, Vene'emanim, they were wise, they were reliable, they were verified in court, the transmitters of our tradition. So why should we stray at all from anything that they said? We can be rest assured that when we follow the halacha as prescribed by the Hachamim, by the Tanaim in the Mishnah, or by the Amoraim in the Talmud, we can be assured and confident that we are fulfilling the Torah without speculation, but as prescribed and transmitted by the Chachamim. See, we have 10 minutes. Let's continue a little bit. Any questions, or you want to do questions? Anybody have questions so far? Or insights, ideas? Okay. Okay. Jacqueline, is that okay. Even so, I still find it surprising that they, the Karaites, continue to observe the laws of ritual purity. I says, okay, so You say, yeah, okay, you convinced me, go according to the Hachamim. Why it's so important to follow the Sanhedrin and the Hachamim, right? You can't actually literally interpret the laws, but the bottom line, we have all these laws of purity and impurity. Only the Karaim are really keeping to those laws today, right? Today, right, when you bake a challah, you do a frashat challah and you burn it. Why? Because it's tameh. Because we're all impure. Nobody follows the laws of impurity today. This is why. We say, okay, well, purity or tumayin tahara and sanctity, kodesh or kedusha, they're parallel concepts. One cannot be understood without the other. Without holiness, the concept of impurity is not what has no meaning. What does tum'ah and tahara come to do? It has a very specific function. If you are tameh, it means you can't touch something that is kadosh. If you are tameh, you cannot enter a place that is kadosh. You cannot enter the azara in the mikdash if you have tumat metim. It has absolutely no bearing on anything else in your life, not halakhic or spiritual or otherwise. That's all it comes to do. It's a means to keep you away from the Kodesh. Let's see what that means. Impurity means that a person is temporarily barred from approaching things that God has made holy, such as the priests, their sacred foods, the garments, the offerings, the sacrifices, and the temple itself. Kodesh, Kedusha, is all associated with the temple and its service, or the people in service of the temple. That's it. Tum'ah means that you're barred from, for whatever reason, you touched, you touched a snake or a lizard, you cannot now touch something that is, how do you call it, challah or teruma. What is challah? Challah is a gift to the Kohen. What is teruma? It's a donation from your produce to the Kohen or to the Mikdash. What is Kodesh? What is the Kodesh? Kodesh is a section of the Mikdash. Mikdash is Kodesh, right? Same word. Tameh, if you are Tameh, you're barred from entering the Kodesh. That's what it means. Nothing more and nothing less. Chachamim then said certain things, like for instance, a Sefer Torah defiles the hands, makes your hands Tameh. Why? They wanted to separate from, we'll call it the pagan idea of holy relics, where everyone tries to touch holy relics, right? That makes you kadosh or something. Says no, the opposite, right? If you touch a holy relic, so to speak, like a Sefer Torah, your hands become tameh, and now you'll need to do netila or something, or go to the mikveh before doing something that requires you to be tahor. Likewise, holiness imposes restrictions on the person connected to it, limiting his contact with certain ordinary things. All of this is fundamentally connected to the presence of the Shekhinah, which we no longer possess in its full form today. In the Shekhinah, where does the Shekhinah reside? Shekhinah means to reside. What does the word Shekhinah come from? When God commands us to build a mikdash, He says, "Ve'asuni mikdash," they shall construct a mikdash for me. "Ve'shachanti betocham," and I shall dwell among them. It says, if we have no mikdash, so to speak, it's as if God isn't dwelling among us. But where's the dwelling place of God? Where is the Shekhinah? It's in the mikdash. That's why I hate it when people say things like the temple or the Western Wall is one of the holy sites of Judaism. No, it's not one of the holy sites of Judaism. In Judaism, there is one holy site, and that's the temple and the Temple Mount, right? There are no other holy sites, zero holy sites after that, right? Graves aren't holy. The opposite. They cause tum'ah. If you go to a grave, whether it's of Avraham Avinu or any saint rabbi or anybody else, you get tum'at metim. The same way. There's no holiness in graves. The opposite. They restrict you from going to the Mikdash afterwards. There is one holy site in Judaism that is the Mikdash. And the whole purpose of Tum'ah in Tahara is to bar you from the Mikdash unless you prepare yourself intentionally for going to the Mikdash. Meaning, if you're going to the Mikdash, you need to make sure first you go to the mikveh. You need to make sure you don't touch anything like the week leading up to that. It's all for you to prepare yourself to go to the Mikdash. And if you don't prepare yourself properly, then you cannot go to the Mikdash. That is the entire purpose of Tumah and Tahara. So he says, with all the respect to the Karaites that are continuing to observe the laws of ritual purity, it's meaningless if there's no Mikdash. There's no point. Doesn't make any change in you. You being Tameh and you being Tahor doesn't make you holier or less holy. It just means, can you go to the Mikdash or not? That's it. The prohibition against relations with a woman during menstruation or after childbirth remains in force, but it is not primarily a law of ritual impurity. Even we say nida, right? There's tumat nida. How do you absolve yourself from nida? You go to the mikveh, but it's not a matter of purity and impurity. It's an independent divine commandment. It's all in order to keep the husband away from the wife. It's the same thing. And it all comes down to, bottom line, a legal definition. Is something tameh or tahor by legal decree? The additional practices of maintaining distance are safeguards intended to prevent transgression. There's more examples here. We'll get into that next week, I suppose. And any questions on today's material? Okay, so the main lesson that we need to take away is we've already established that speculative religion is meaningless. God wants us to follow the Torah, his commandments, as he commanded. And even reading the Torah and knowing how to fulfill it could potentially be left up to speculation. And we don't need to worry about speculation. We have a tradition. We follow the Chachamim. The Chachamim have the authority. They receive the authority from God to inform us, to instruct us how to fulfill the mitzvot of the Torah. And that's what we need to do. And don't be fooled by people who are extra strict who even like the Karaites who continue to maintain the laws of purity and impurity, it's meaningless when it's not within its prescribed context. So there's nothing to fear by keeping the mitzvot, as lenient as they may sometimes be, right? Because you are relying on the authority and the wisdom of the Hachamim. And that's what we need to be striving to follow the mitzvot according to the halacha, as transmitted by our tradition. And that's it for today. And we'll continue next week. We'll go into a few other laws. He gets into the Eruv of Shabbat that we do or don't do. And so we'll see you all next week, and we'll continue.
Thank you, Shami.
Thank you.